She spilled water on the most dangerous man in the city, and he smiled. Not the polite smile of a man who forgives accidents. The slow, deliberate smile of a man who has just decided something. Roman Moretti didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't look at the spreading stain on his shirt the way every other man in that room would have, with irritation, with embarrassment, with contempt. He looked at her, and Lena Hartwell, 26 years old, exhausted down to her bones, felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. She felt seen. That was the beginning of everything. And God help her, it was also the beginning of the end. If you're watching from your city tonight, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, stay until the very last word, and let's begin. Seagate. The restaurant was called Salone, and it had no business existing in a city like this one. It sat on the corner of Meridian and Fifth, squeezed between a parking garage and a dry cleaner's that had been closed for 3 years, and yet somehow, through some alchemy of money and reputation that Lena had never been able to fully understand, it had become the kind of place where men in $20,000 suits came to discuss things that were never written down. The interior was all dark wood and low amber lighting. The wine list was leather-bound and 30 pages long. The kitchen used ingredients that were flown in from places Lena had only seen on maps. The tablecloths were changed between every single course. Pure white linen, ironed flat, no wrinkles, no exceptions. And the staff were expected to be invisible. Present without being noticed. Efficient without being human. Lena had been invisible her whole life. She was good at the job. She'd been working the floor at Salone for 2 years and 4 months, which was long enough to know every regular by face and reputation, long enough to know which tables tipped well and which ones would run her for refills all night and leave 17%, long enough to know that on Thursday evenings the private dining room in the back, separated from the main floor by a frosted glass partition and a pair of heavy velvet curtains, was reserved for a rotating cast of men whose names she tried not to learn, not out of apathy, out of instinct. There were things you understood when you worked a floor like this one. The men who came through the private room on Thursdays were not the kind of men who wanted their servers to have opinions. They weren't even the kind of men who wanted their servers to have faces. You came in, you poured, you disappeared. You kept your eyes down and your mouth shut, and you were grateful for the cash at the end of the night. Lena understood that. She'd understood it from the first week, which made what happened on the third Thursday of November all the more stupid. She was tired. That was the first thing. Not the normal bottom-of-a-shift tired, but the deep, marrow-level exhaustion that had been her constant companion for the last 3 years, since the nursing program, since Nathan, since the whole beautiful future she'd built in her head had collapsed like a structure with no foundation, which was exactly what it had been. She'd worked a double. Her feet had been aching since noon. She'd eaten nothing since a protein bar at 2 in the afternoon, and she could feel the absence of food as a low, persistent hum somewhere behind her eyes. Her manager, Dale, had called in 2 of the evening staff. Food poisoning, he said, though Lena suspected it was a concert, and so she was covering the private room alone, which was not how it was supposed to work, which Dale knew perfectly well. "You'll be fine," he'd told her, straightening his tie in the back hallway mirror. "It's only 1 table, in and out. There are 8 of them. Lena." "Dale, I'm telling you, 8 men ordering separately, 3 courses each. Lena." He'd given her the look, the one that meant, "You need this job more than I need to hear this. You'll be fine." She'd bitten down on everything she wanted to say and gone back to work. By 9:15 she was managing. Barely, but managing. 6 of the 8 men were straightforward enough. Corporate types, she thought. The legitimate kind or close enough to it. The ones who ordered the rack of lamb and the aged Barolo and talked about quarterly projections in voices just low enough that she couldn't quite make out the specifics. They barely looked at her. That was fine. Preferred, even. It was the 2 men at the far end of the table who were different. She'd noticed them immediately, the way you noticed a change in air pressure before a storm. They sat slightly apart from the others, not rudely, not obviously, but with a quality of separation that felt deliberate. The man on the left was large, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that suggested he had not always been still. A bodyguard, or something like one. He'd ordered water and nothing else, and had spent the entire evening watching the room with the patient, systematic attention of someone cataloging exits. The man on the right was Roman Moretti. She hadn't known his name then. She would learn it later. In the moment, she knew only what she saw. A man somewhere in his late 30s, dark-haired, lean in the way of someone who hadn't let comfort make him soft. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, collar open at the throat. His hands, folded loosely on the table, were the hands of a man who worked with them, or had once. There was a scar along the back of his left knuckle that the dim light caught at certain angles. He was the quietest person at the table. He let the others talk. He listened with an expression that gave nothing away, and occasionally said something brief and quiet that made the men around him laugh, or nod, or go very still, depending on what he'd said. She'd served him twice already without incident, kept her eyes down, did the job. The third time was the problem. She was coming around the right side of the table with a full water pitcher, heavy, her wrist already aching from 3 hours of carrying, when one of the corporate men shifted unexpectedly in his chair. Not dramatically, just moved. The way people move at dinner without thinking, without realizing that someone is directly behind them. His elbow caught her forearm. The pitcher tipped. It happened in the slow, particular way that disasters always happen when you've already seen them coming and have no power to stop them. A fraction of a second stretched into something much longer. She saw the arc of the water before it fell. Saw the exact line it would take. Saw the immaculate white tablecloth in front of Roman Moretti and the cut crystal glass beside his plate and the dark sleeve of his jacket resting just at the table's edge. The water hit the tablecloth with a sound like a soft exhale. It spread. Fast, the way water always does on linen. Indifferent, absolute, ruinous. The crystal glass tipped, caught itself against the bread plate. Didn't break, but rocked there for a moment with the particular drama of something that very nearly had. The table went quiet. Lena stood there with the empty pitcher and felt the silence land on her skin like a physical thing. The corporate men were staring. The large man on the left had shifted forward in his chair. Not threateningly, but alert, the way an animal gets when something unexpected happens near the thing it protects. Roman Moretti looked down at the spreading water on the tablecloth in front of him. Then he looked up. At her. She braced for it. Knew it was coming. Had experienced it before. The cold dismissal, the flash of contempt, the quiet cruelty of powerful men who didn't need to raise their voices because the whole world already knew they could. She straightened her spine and prepared her apology, the automatic practiced one, the one that took no dignity to deliver because she'd learned long ago to keep her dignity somewhere the job couldn't reach it. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'll have this cleaned immediately. Sit down for a second," Roman Moretti said. She stopped. "Excuse me. You're about to fall over." He said it matter-of-factly, without pity, without cruelty, like he was simply observing a structural problem. "The chair right there is empty. Sit down for a second before you drop that pitcher on someone." The corporate men exchanged glances. The large man on the left relaxed almost imperceptibly. Lena looked at the empty chair, looked at the man, looked at the spreading water on his tablecloth, already soaking through to the wood beneath. "Sir, I really need to—" "The tablecloth is already wet." His voice hadn't changed pitch. "Sitting down for 30 seconds won't make it wetter." Something about the logic of it, the calm, slightly absurd logic, caught her off guard. She stood there another moment, pitcher in hand, the entire private dining room watching her, and she made a decision that she would think about for a long time afterward. She did not sit down. She was not going to sit down at a customer's table in the middle of a shift, not for any reason, not even this one. But she stopped apologizing. "I'll get someone to change the cloth immediately," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, and she looked at him directly when she said it. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something small and precise, like a door opening a single inch. "Take your time," he said. She went and got Dale, who came back radiating the specific anxiety of a man managing a situation he doesn't fully understand, and the tablecloth was changed and the rest of the service passed without incident. Lena moved through it on autopilot, refills, plates, clearing, the mechanical competence of someone who had done this so many times it required no thought. She didn't look at Roman Moretti again. She was careful about that. When the table finally cleared out near 11 o'clock, she was already in the back, counting her side work, trying to calculate whether she had enough in her account to cover the electric bill and the student loan payment that were both due Friday, and the answer was no, not both. Not without something going right that she wasn't currently anticipating. Dale appeared at the kitchen door. "Table 12 left you something?" She assumed it was the usual. The private room tipped reasonably, not extravagantly. Another thing she'd learned not to expect extravagance. Dale was holding a small cream-colored envelope with her name on it. Lena, in handwriting that was deliberate and slightly formal. And beneath the envelope, folded neatly, was a stack of bills that she didn't touch until she was alone. $800. She stood in the back hallway of Salone and stared at $800 in cash and a handwritten note on heavy cream paper, and she read the note twice before she let herself think about what it meant. "Be careful looking at me like that." That was all it said. No name, no number, just those 6 words in the same deliberate handwriting, and Lena stood there with $800 she hadn't expected, and a warning she didn't know what to do with. And the exhaustion that had been with her all day was still there, but something had moved inside it. Some small, stubborn, stupid thing that she recognized as hope and immediately distrusted. She tucked the money into her apron, folded the note once and put it in her pocket, finished her side work, clocked out. On the bus home, 40 minutes, because she didn't own a car, hadn't owned one since the transmission went on her Civic 2 years ago, and she'd had to make a choice between fixing it and making rent. She took the note out and read it again. "Be careful looking at me like that." She hadn't been looking at him like anything. She'd been looking at him the way you look at someone who is about to make your night significantly worse, with dread and professional wariness. Whatever he'd seen in her face, it wasn't what he thought it was. She put the note away, looked out the rain-streaked bus window at the city sliding past in smears of light and shadow. That night, in her apartment, 600 square feet on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of other people's cooking and whose elevator had been out of service for 11 months. She lay on her bed without changing out of her work clothes and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since she moved in. And she thought about $800. $800 was her electric bill and her student loan payment, with enough left over for groceries. $800 was the difference between this week being survivable and this week being something she'd have to patch together with credit cards she was already avoiding opening the statements for. $800 was a man who'd seen her about to fall over and told her to sit down as if he had the right to give her instructions, and had then paid her for an accident that was almost certainly her fault. She didn't like it. The amount was too precise, too considered. It wasn't the casual generosity of a rich man throwing money at a problem. It was something else, something that felt like a statement. She pulled the note out of her pocket one more time. "Be careful looking at me like that." She set it on the nightstand, turned off the light. She was going to forget about it. She was good at forgetting about things she couldn't afford to think about. She was asleep in less than 10 minutes, which was the other thing she was good at, sleeping through things that frightened her. She woke up at 6 to the alarm on her phone, which had a cracked screen she hadn't been able to afford to fix, and she got up and showered in water that took 4 minutes to get warm, and she drank coffee standing at her kitchen counter looking at the back alley through a window that needed recaulking before winter, and she told herself the note was nothing. By noon, she was less certain. She was working the lunch shift at Salone, slower, less lucrative than evenings, but Dale needed the coverage and she needed the hours. When her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize, she ignored it. She was mid-table. It buzzed again. She finished the table, went to the service station, and checked the message. The water was cold. Next time, room temperature. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she typed back, "How did you get this number?" The response came in under 30 seconds. "I get most things I want. Room temperature. Don't forget." She put her phone face down on the service station counter and stood very still for a moment, her heart doing something complicated in her chest that she recognized as fear and refused to call anything else. He knew her name. He had her number. He knew she was working today, which meant he either had someone watching Salone or, worse, he already knew her schedule. She thought about the $800 in her apron the night before. The note. "Be careful looking at me like that." This was not a man being flirtatious. Or it was, but underneath the flirtation was something much more structural. The way a smile can be real and still be a warning at the same time. She picked up her phone. "I don't know who you are," she typed. But I need you to understand that I'm just a server. Last night was an accident. I'd appreciate if you'd leave it at that." She sent it before she could think too hard about whether it was smart. The response took longer this time, almost 2 minutes. "You're not just anything, Lena. We'll talk soon." She read it 3 times, put her phone in her apron pocket, went back to her tables. Dale caught her expression when she came back to the floor and gave her a look that said, "Whatever that is, handle it on your own time." She arranged her face into something neutral and took a drink order from a couple by the window and smiled at them with the practiced warmth of a woman who had learned to separate her face from her interior. "We'll talk soon. Not, I'd like to talk. Not would you like to meet. Just, we'll talk soon." As if the conversation was already scheduled. As if her agreement was a detail he'd already accounted for. She should have been angrier. Part of her was. But underneath the anger was something she hated herself for. Something she didn't have a clean word for. The feeling of being in someone's field of vision after years of being overlooked. She'd spent 3 years being invisible. 3 years since the collapse of everything she'd been building. Since Nathan had taken what she'd given him and left her with the wreckage. And she'd put her head down and worked and survived and told herself that was enough. That invisible was safe. And in 12 hours, this man, this stranger who she knew only by his stillness and his handwriting, had looked at her twice and made her feel like a person who existed. She hated that. She resented it deeply. She also couldn't stop thinking about it. He came back on Saturday. Not to the restaurant. To the coffee place 2 blocks east of Saloni where Lena spent 40 minutes every morning before her shift, because it was the one thing she allowed herself that felt like a choice. A real one, not a survival decision, just a preference. The coffee was better there than anywhere else nearby, and she liked the woman behind the counter, Maria, who always remembered her order and never tried to make conversation beyond the functional. She was sitting at the table by the window, both hands wrapped around her cup, watching the morning foot traffic and not thinking about anything in particular, when she became aware of someone sitting down across from her. She looked up. Roman Moretti was wearing a gray cable-knit sweater and looked approximately the same as he had in the restaurant, except less formal and somehow, because of that, more dangerous. The suit had been armor. The sweater was something else. A deliberate choice to look like less than he was, which required knowing what you were. "You have a lot of nerve," Lena said. "Good morning." He nodded toward her cup. "Is it good?" "I'm not having this conversation." "You're already having it." He signaled to Maria without looking at the counter, and Maria, who Lena had known for 2 years, who Lena had believed to be a straightforward person, brought over a black coffee without being asked, which meant she'd been told, which meant he'd been here before she arrived. Lena set down her cup. "You knew I'd be here. I know a lot of things about you. That's supposed to reassure me?" He looked at her steadily. His eyes were dark, almost black in the morning light, and they had the quality she'd noticed in the restaurant of taking everything in without reacting to any of it. A collector's eyes. Patient and exact. "I'm not trying to reassure you," he said. "I'm trying to talk to you." "About what?" "About the fact that you're behind on 3 bills and you're covering shifts for people who don't deserve the coverage, and you haven't told your manager that your wrist has been hurting for 2 months because you're afraid he'll cut your hours." He said it quietly, without inflection, the way you state facts rather than revelations. "About the fact that you were 18 credits from a nursing degree when you dropped out and you haven't been back and you tell yourself it's money, but it's not just money." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of something landing. Lena looked at him, felt the warmth go out of her coffee and didn't reach for it. "Who are you?" she asked. "Roman Moretti." As if it was simple, as if she should know what that meant. She didn't. Not yet. "How do you know those things about me?" "I asked people who know." "What people?" He didn't answer that, just watched her with those exact, unhurried eyes, and she understood that she wasn't going to get a straight answer to that question, and she understood why, and it did not make her feel better. "What do you want?" she asked. "To have breakfast with you." He picked up his coffee. "Nothing else. Not today." She should have left. Every reasonable thing inside her was pointing toward the door. This was the part of the story where the sensible woman excused herself and went home and didn't look back. Lena Hartwell had not been a sensible woman since the last time sensible had protected her, which was never, which meant she had nothing to lose by staying except the comfort of a decision she'd already made. She picked up her cup. They sat there for 40 minutes. He asked her about the nursing program, not as a line, not with the usual patronizing encouragement she got from people who meant well, but with the specific curiosity of someone who wanted to know the mechanics of things. What had she been studying? What had drawn her to it? What the work actually looked like, day to day, in a hospital. She found herself answering, not in the clipped, defensive way she'd answered these questions from other people, but actually answering, the long version, the one she kept for herself. About the clinical rotation she'd done in her second year, the pediatric floor, the kid with the broken arm who'd been terrified of the needle, and she'd sat with him for 20 minutes finding out what his favorite superhero was. And by the time she'd given him the injection, he'd been so deep into explaining the plot of a movie that he hadn't even noticed. Roman listened the way he did everything, completely, without interrupting, without reaching for his phone, without the half-distracted quality that most people had when someone else was talking. When she finished, he said, "That's not a job. That's a calling." She looked at him. "Don't." The word came out harder than she intended. "Don't what?" "Don't do that. Don't say things like that." She set her cup down. "I don't know what this is. I don't know what you want from me. But I've had people say things like that before, and I've learned what it usually costs." Something shifted in his expression. Not softened. Roman Moretti was not a man who softened. But something behind the stillness moved, very briefly, and she had the strange sense of having accidentally said something that landed somewhere real. "That's fair," he said. She hadn't expected that. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he continued. "I'm asking you to have breakfast." "You had it. It's done." He stood, pulled out his wallet. She noticed the wallet, but not what was in it, refused to look, and put something on the table. "I'll see you around, Lena." He walked out. The door swung closed behind him. She looked down at the table. A card. Just a phone number, handwritten on plain white stock. No name, no title, just 10 digits. And underneath it, because apparently he'd paid for her coffee too, a receipt with a tip that was 3 times the total bill. She picked up the card, turned it over. Blank on the back. Maria appeared at her elbow with the coffee pot, filling her cup without being asked. "You know who he is?" Lena asked her. Maria looked at the door, then at Lena, with an expression that was careful in a way that Lena hadn't seen from her before. "I know he's the kind of person you don't say no to," Maria said. "That's all I know. That's all I want to know." She refilled the cup and went back behind the counter. Lena sat with that for a long time. She didn't call. 4 days passed and she didn't call. And she told herself this was the right decision, the smart one, the one she would thank herself for later. She went to her shifts, she covered the bills, the 800 had solved Friday, and this week was looking marginally better. She called her mother, who lived in Dayton, and worried about her in a way that was loving and also exhausting, and she said everything was fine. It was on the 5th day, coming off a closing shift at 11:30 on a Tuesday, rain again, the same persistent autumn rain that had been falling in this city for 2 weeks, that she stepped out of the back door of Saloni and found a black car idling at the curb. Not aggressively, not blocking her way, just parked there, engine running, and as she came out, the passenger window came down and the large man from the restaurant, the one she'd clocked as a bodyguard, looked at her from the driver's seat. "Mr. Moretti wanted to make sure you got home safe," he said. His voice matched his appearance, large, flat, functional. "It's late. The rain." Lena stood on the wet sidewalk and looked at the car and thought about her options. 40-minute bus ride, wet, alone, 11:30 at night. Or this. She thought about what Maria had said. The kind of person you don't say no to. She thought about the note. "Be careful looking at me like that." She thought about the pediatric floor and the kid with the broken arm and the 20-minute conversation about superheroes, and she thought about what it had felt like when Roman Moretti had called it a calling, like he meant it, like it was a fact rather than a consolation. She got in the car. The large man, whose name, she would learn later, was Gio, drove without talking, which she appreciated. The heat was on. The seat was warm. Outside, the city went past in blurs of neon and rain, and Lena sat in the back of a stranger's car and didn't let herself think about what she was doing. When they reached her building, Gio came around and opened the door, which she hadn't expected. She got out. looked up at the building, the crumbling facade, the still broken elevator sign in the lobby window. Her phone buzzed. "Did you get home okay?" She looked at the message for a moment. "Yes," she typed back. "Thank you. You didn't need to do that." The response came fast. "I know. Get some rest. You work again tomorrow." She stood in the rain outside her building, phone in hand, and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. The specific, treacherous, awful warmth of someone giving a damn about whether you got home safe. She knew better. She knew exactly how this worked, the mathematics of it, the attention, the gifts, the careful accumulated weight of small gestures until the scales tipped and you found yourself somewhere you'd never planned to go. She knew all of that. She still stood there in the rain for a moment longer than she needed to, holding her phone, before she went inside. Upstairs in her apartment, she put the card from the coffee shop on the nightstand beside the note. "Be careful looking at me like that." She'd spent 4 days being careful. She didn't know how much longer she could manage it. She called the number on Friday morning, not because she'd decided anything, not because she'd talked herself into it or out of it or reached any kind of resolution. She called it because it was 7 in the morning and she'd been awake since 5, and the silence of her apartment felt heavier than usual, and she was tired. Not the shift tired, not the physical tired, but the other kind, the kind that sleep didn't fix. It rang twice. "Lena." He answered like he'd been expecting it, but not smugly, just present, like he'd been there the whole time. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "Why me?" She kept her voice even. "There are easier women. Women who don't ask questions. Women who wouldn't make this complicated." She paused. "Why me?" The silence on his end was brief, thoughtful. "Because you almost fell over carrying a water pitcher, and instead of apologizing to save yourself, you looked me in the eye." Another brief pause. "And because you haven't asked me for anything." She held the phone and felt the treacherous warmth again and hated herself thoroughly for it. "I have a lot of questions," she said. "I know. Some of them you're not going to answer. Some of them, no. And you want me to be okay with that. I want you to decide for yourself whether you are." His voice was the same as always, level, direct, neither demanding nor pleading. "That's all I want. I don't need you to trust me. I need you to make a real choice, not one I've made for you." She looked out the window at the back alley. The rain had finally stopped. Morning light was coming through thin and gray. "Dinner," she said. "That's it. I'm not agreeing to anything else." "Dinner," he said. "That's enough for now." She hung up and sat there a moment in the gray morning light and told herself she was being careful, that she had her eyes open, that this was controlled. She believed it, mostly. She believed it right up until the moment she found herself, the following Tuesday evening, in the back of Gio's car in a dress she'd bought on her lunch break because nothing she owned felt right, watching the city go past in the window, and realizing with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, she was already falling. The restaurant he took her to didn't have a sign. That was the first thing she noticed. Gio pulled the car to a stop on a narrow side street in the warehouse district, the kind of neighborhood that looked abandoned from the outside and wasn't. And when she stepped out onto the wet pavement and looked at the building in front of her, there was nothing on the facade except a black door and a single small light above it, the kind of light that existed only to tell you someone was home. "Where are we?" she asked. "Inside," Gio said, which was not an answer. The door opened before she could knock. She hadn't knocked, hadn't had time to. And a man she didn't recognize held it and said nothing and stepped aside, and she walked in. She'd been prepared for something theatrical, prepared for the kind of conspicuous luxury that powerful men used to impress, the kind that said, "Look at what I can do, look at what I have." She'd braced for it, because she'd decided on the drive over that she would not be impressed, that she was going to eat dinner and ask her questions and go home, and that would be that. She was not prepared for the kitchen. It was a kitchen in a converted warehouse space, just the two of them. The other man had disappeared, with a long wooden table already set for dinner, and something on the stove that smelled like garlic and tomato and red wine, and something deeper underneath it that she couldn't name. Roman was at the counter with his back to her, stirring. He was in jeans and a dark shirt, sleeves pushed up. No suit, no performance. "You cook," she said. I do a lot of things. He didn't turn around immediately. Sit wherever you want. There's wine on the table. She stood in the middle of the room and felt the ground shift slightly under the version of this evening she'd constructed in her head. The version with the restaurant and the ambient noise and the clean social architecture of a public place. All of that fell away, and what was left was just this: a man at a stove cooking dinner, and her, standing in the middle of someone else's domestic warmth with no script. She sat down, poured herself wine, read something she didn't recognize on the label. Is this your place? She asked. One of them. How many do you have? Enough. He turned finally, with a pot and a cloth, and set it on the trivet at the center of the table. Looked at her. You're nervous. I'm fine. You're pouring that wine like you're going to drink the whole bottle before the first course. She looked at the glass in her hand, set it down deliberately. I'm fine, she said again. He sat across from her and served the pasta, something with a ragu that she identified as bolognese before he told her, because she'd grown up making it with her mother, the cheap version, the version with ground beef instead of the 3-meat blend he'd used. And for a few minutes, neither of them said anything, and she ate, and it was extraordinary, and she resented how extraordinary it was. Tell me something true, she said finally. He looked up from his plate. About what? About you. Not the version I'm supposed to get. The actual version. He held her gaze for a moment, set down his fork. I was born in Naples, he said. I came here when I was 19 with $2,000 and a name that meant something in a world I was trying to get out of. I didn't get out. He picked up his fork again. That's true. What world? You know what world. She did. She'd known since Maria's face in the coffee shop, since the car, since the way other people moved around him with that specific careful deference that wasn't about money. Money made people obsequious. This was different. This was fear that had been domesticated into politeness. The mafia, she said. He didn't react to the word, just looked at her steadily. That word's a simplification. Most words are. She kept her voice even. Am I wrong? No. She absorbed that, looked at her wine glass, looked back at him. So what is this? She gestured between them. What am I doing here? Having dinner? Don't. Lena, I said don't. Her voice had an edge that surprised her, or maybe didn't. I'm not a naive person. I know what men like you do with women like me. I know how the story goes. You're charming, and then you're generous, and then I'm grateful, and then I'm... She stopped, pressed her mouth together. I need to know what you actually want. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of two people in a room where something real had just been said. Roman looked at her for a long moment. His expression was, she searched for the word, honest. Not gentle, not apologetic. Just honest, which was somehow more unsettling than either. I want to know you, he said. That's it. That's the whole thing. He paused. I'm aware that's not a simple answer given what I am. I'm not asking you to pretend it is. She looked at him. People who know you, she said carefully, are they safe? Something crossed his face. Very brief. The ones I choose to know, he said. Yes. That's a very specific answer. It's the only honest one I have. She picked up her wine, drank, set it down. I had a fiancé, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. Not the whole story, just the word, just the fact of it, dropped on the table between them like a coin she'd been carrying too long. It's not important right now, but I need you to understand something. She looked directly at him. I have already lost everything I built once because I trusted someone I shouldn't have. So whatever this is, she paused again. I need you to be more honest with me than is probably comfortable for you, or I walk out that door and we're done. Roman held her gaze the whole time she spoke. Didn't look away, didn't shift, didn't make the reassuring noises that men usually made when a woman drew a line in the sand. He just listened. Then, okay. One word. She blinked. Okay? What do you want to know? She hadn't expected that either. She'd expected negotiation, deflection, the smooth redirection of a man who'd spent years managing what other people knew about him. She asked 3 questions over the next hour. She asked about his business, not the details. She didn't want the details, just the shape of it, where the lines were. He answered in terms that were careful, but not dishonest. She asked whether she was in danger simply by sitting at this table. He said, "Not from anyone I control," and there was a weight to that no one else controls being implied in the space after control that she decided to take seriously. She asked why he'd sent $800. "Because you needed it," he said, "and because you were too proud to take it any other way." She opened her mouth, closed it. "That's accurate?" She looked at the ceiling, exhaled. "Yes," she admitted. Something happened to his expression then, a small, private thing, not quite a smile, but in that territory, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest and firmly told it to leave. They stayed at the table for 3 hours. The second dinner was at his apartment, which was in a building on the east side of the city where the architecture had money built into the bones of it. Gio drove. She'd stopped pretending this arrangement made her uncomfortable. The third was at the same kitchen in the warehouse because she'd told him during the second dinner that she'd liked it better than the apartment, and he'd listened, which she was starting to understand was a significant thing about him. He listened, and then he acted on what he'd heard, without comment, without making it a gesture. By the third dinner, she'd told him about Nathan. Not all of it, the shape of it, the outline. They'd been together 4 years. He'd been a law student, she a nursing student, both of them broke and ambitious and in love in the specific, exhausting way of people building something from nothing. She'd worked extra shifts to cover their rent when his loan disbursements were delayed. She'd deferred her last clinical placement because he'd needed her available for the bar exam study period. She'd lent him money, not lent, she understood now, given, in amounts that had added up to nearly $12,000 over the final 2 years. He'd passed the bar, taken a job at a firm in Chicago, and 3 months later he'd called her from Chicago to tell her he'd met someone else. A colleague. Someone more. He'd used the word aligned, which she'd thought about for months afterward. The specific violence of that word. The idea that she'd been misaligned with the future he'd always privately imagined for himself. He'd kept the money. There was nothing to do about the money. She hadn't had anything in writing. She'd been 23. She'd deferred so many things that coming back to them felt impossible. She'd gotten the waitressing job because she needed income immediately, and it was the fastest thing, and then 2 years had become 2 years and 4 months, and here she was. Roman listened to all of this the way he'd listened to everything, completely. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment, then, "What's his name?" She looked up. "Why?" He held her gaze. "Just asking. Nathan Keller." She said it before she thought about whether she should. Then, "Why does his name matter?" "It doesn't," Roman said. "Not tonight." There was something in the flatness of it that she filed away and did not examine directly, because she understood instinctively that some things in this man's mind were better not illuminated. She changed the subject. He let her. The problem with falling was that it happened in increments small enough to dismiss individually. It was the Tuesday she came off a double and found, outside her apartment door, a paper bag with a container of soup and a note that said only, "You forget to eat on long shifts." It was the Thursday when her wrist finally gave out entirely. The tendinitis she'd been ignoring for 2 months, flaring into something she could no longer pretend wasn't real. And she texted him not asking for anything, just mentioning it, and within 4 hours there was a doctor at her door. Not a clinic, a doctor, who examined her wrist and gave her a brace and a prescription and a follow-up appointment and charged her nothing. She'd called Roman immediately. "I didn't ask for that," she said. "I know. You can't just... Your wrist is better?" She gripped the phone. "That is not the point." "What's the point?" "The point is that I'm not someone you manage. I'm not a problem you solve. I'm a person." A pause. "I know you're a person, Lena." His voice was quiet. "I sent a doctor because your wrist hurt. That's the whole reason." She stood in her apartment with the brace on her wrist and the prescriptions on the counter and felt the argument dissolve before she could finish building it, which infuriated her, which told her something about how far along this already was. "Stop knowing things about me," she said. "No." She hung up, stared at the ceiling, called him back 7 minutes later. "I'm sorry," she said. Don't apologize for having limits. She pressed her hand against her eyes. You're very difficult. You're not easy either. I know. A pause. The soup was good, by the way, on Tuesday. Minestrone from the place on Cedar. You mentioned it once. She had, 6 days earlier, in passing. She hadn't thought he was listening. He was always listening. The night it broke open was a Wednesday, 5 weeks in. She'd been closing at Saloni when a man she didn't know sat down at the bar and asked for her by name. Not in a customer way. In the way that meant the message was for her and the medium was irrelevant. He was young, early 30s, with the kind of face that arranged itself into pleasantness without being pleasant. He ordered a whiskey. He waited until she came over. Ms. Hartwell, he said, I work for some people who are interested in Mr. Moretti's business. Lena felt her body go very still, the automatic animal stillness of prey that hasn't decided which direction to run. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. You've been seeing him for 5 weeks. He smiled, not warmly. We know where you have dinner. We know the warehouse on Brennan Street. We know the doctor he sent to your apartment. He tilted the whiskey glass in his hand. We're not trying to frighten you. We just want to understand the nature of your relationship. And who exactly is we? People with a professional interest in the territory Mr. Moretti manages. She looked at him. Her heart was doing something loud behind her sternum, but her face, she kept her face the way she'd learned to keep it over 2 years of serving men who traded in power. I'm a waitress, she said. I'm nobody. You've got the wrong person. Ms. Hartwell. We're done. She stepped back. Order something or leave. She went to the service station and texted Roman with hands that were not entirely steady. There's a man at my bar. He says he works for people interested in your business. He knows about the warehouse. The response came in 40 seconds. Don't talk to him. Don't look at him. Gio is 3 minutes away. I can't just walk out of my shift. Yes, you can. 3 minutes. She went to Dale and said she had a family emergency. Dale looked at her face and didn't push back. She grabbed her coat from the back and walked out the side door, and Gio was there in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, not 3. In the car, her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed through her nose and told herself this was fine, that this was manageable, that this was a misunderstanding. Gio drove without talking. Roman was at the warehouse when she arrived. Not calm, she realized, or rather, not calm in his usual way. There was something tightly contained in how he was standing, how he moved to meet her when she came in, and she'd been around him enough now to read the difference. Are you hurt? He asked. No. He didn't touch me. He just... She pulled in a breath. He just talked. Who are those people? Roman turned from her, walked to the window. His hands were in his pockets and his back was to her, and she watched the line of his shoulders and thought, here it is, the thing behind the curtain. Competition, he said finally. Competition, she repeated it. Men who send someone to talk to the woman I'm having dinner with are not competition. That's... She stopped, organized herself. That's a threat, Roman. Aimed at me, because of you. He turned around. His face was controlled. The word was controlled, but underneath it something was running hot, and she could see it. I know what it is. Then you know that I... She pressed her hand against her sternum. I am not equipped for this. I am a person who works double shifts and takes the bus home. I don't belong in whatever this is. Lena, no. She held up her hand. I need you to hear me. That man knew my name. He knew my apartment. He knew I had a doctor come over. Her voice was cracking at the edges, and she hated it. He knew things that I thought were private, and the reason he knows them is because of you. Because we've been... She stopped, breathed. I need to know if I'm safe, she said quietly. Not the answer you want to give me, the real answer. Roman held her gaze. His jaw was tight. Those men will not touch you, he said. I'll handle it. That is not what I asked. I know what you asked. He crossed the room, not quickly, but with a deliberateness that was somehow more intense than speed, and stopped close enough that she could have touched him without reaching. You are safe. I am telling you that as a fact, not a reassurance. She looked up at him, read his face. "I want to believe you," she said. "Then believe me." "It's not," she exhaled sharply. "It's not that simple." "I know it's not simple." Something moved in his expression. "Nothing about this is simple, Lena. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that it is." He paused. "But I'm asking you not to run." The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere, a car passed on the wet street. She looked at him. This man who cooked pasta and sent soup and listened to everything and knew her shift schedule and had done things she would probably never know the full extent of, who had called it a calling, who had shown up at her coffee shop on a Saturday morning and said, "I get most things I want," like it was a simple statement of physics. "Why?" she asked. "Why does it matter if I run?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you're the first person in 10 years who's asked me a real question and waited for a real answer." He said it without decoration. "And because I don't want to be the reason you stop doing that." She felt it hit somewhere she'd been guarding carefully. "I'm not going to run," she said. And then, before she could pull it back, "But if you lie to me, even once, I'm gone. I don't care what any of this costs. I'm gone." "I know," he said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it." His voice was quiet. "That's one of the things that matters." She stood there a moment longer. Then she sat down on the bench by the wall because her legs had been carrying a lot since the bar, and she pressed her hands between her knees, and he didn't crowd her, didn't reach for her, just sat down at the other end of the bench and waited. After a while, she said, "Are they going to come back? Those men?" "Yes." "And you're going to do something about it?" "Yes." She nodded, stared at the floor. "I don't want to know the details," she said. "I know. But if it puts me in danger, if anything changes, you'll know immediately." A pause. "That's a promise." She looked at the wall in front of her, thought about Nathan's word, aligned, and thought about how it had felt to be misaligned, to be the person who didn't fit the future someone else had privately designed, how long she'd spent after that keeping herself small enough to fit the spaces that were left. "I went to the farmer's market last Sunday," she said, out of nowhere. Roman looked at her. There was a woman selling handmade quilts. She pressed her fingers together. "I stood there for 10 minutes looking at one. It was green and white, this pattern. I don't know the name. And she said she'd made it over 3 months, 3 months of choosing each square." She paused. "I thought about how long I've been choosing nothing." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Come back next Sunday." She turned to look at him. "To the market," he said. "I'll go with you." It was such a small thing, such a profoundly ordinary thing, for a man who controlled blocks of a city and spoke in rooms where deals were made that never saw paper. She looked at him. This impossible, dangerous, very real man. "Okay," she said. They sat there together in the warehouse on Brennan Street while the city moved outside, and whatever was coming, and something was coming, she understood that now, felt it in the density of the days, hadn't arrived yet. She still had time. She told herself she still had time. And then her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize, and she answered it because she was still the kind of person who answered unknown numbers because you never knew. And the voice on the other end was female, flat, and careful in the particular way of someone reading from a prepared statement or trying very hard to stay composed. "Is this Lena Hartwell?" "Yes." "My name is Claire Keller." A pause that had weight in it. "I'm Nathan's wife." The warehouse went very quiet around her. "I need to talk to you," the woman said, "about my husband, and about Roman Moretti." Another pause. "And about what's already been put in motion that you don't know about yet." Lena held the phone against her ear and didn't move. Roman was watching her from the other end of the bench. She could feel it. The particular quality of his attention, the way it landed on her like pressure. But she couldn't look at him. Her eyes had fixed on a point on the warehouse floor, a knot in the wood grain, and she was staring at it the way you stare at something small and fixed when the room around you is beginning to tilt. "How did you get this number?" she asked. Her voice came out level. She didn't know how. "That doesn't matter right now." Claire Keller's voice was controlled in the way of someone who had rehearsed this call multiple times and was still not entirely sure she could get through it. "What matters is that you hear what I have to say before something happens that can't be undone." "What do you mean, can't be undone?" Roman had gone very still on the other end of the bench. He wasn't pretending not to hear. He was listening openly, which under other circumstances she might have appreciated. "My husband," Claire said. "Nathan. You knew him." "Yes. Things have been happening to him for about 3 weeks now. His firm put him on indefinite leave. There's an investigation. Someone submitted an anonymous complaint to the state bar, documentation of billing fraud, and the documentation is real, Lena. It's not fabricated. He did those things, but the timing—" Her voice broke slightly and then reassembled. "A client pulled a major account. His car was broken into twice. Our landlord received a letter claiming noise violations that never happened, and we were given 60 days' notice." A pause. "It's systematic. Every piece of it is legal. Every piece of it is deniable. But it's not random." Lena said nothing. "I did some digging," Claire continued, "about who Nathan had been crossing paths with professionally. There was a real estate deal that fell apart 6 months ago. A development on the south side. Nathan represented the other party in a dispute with— it was Moretti Holdings, LLC. Her voice flattened on the name. "I looked into Roman Moretti after that. I know what he is. And then I looked into you." "Why me?" "Because my husband's life is being dismantled," Claire said. "And the only new variable in the last 2 months is you." Lena felt the sentence rearrange the room. She became aware of her own breathing, of the wood grain under her feet, of Roman 3 feet away on the bench with his hands folded and his face giving nothing away. "You think this is because of me," she said. "I think Roman Moretti found out about Nathan through you," Claire said quietly. "I think whatever you told him about what Nathan did, I think that's where this started." The warehouse was very quiet. Lena lowered the phone. She didn't hang up. She just lowered it and looked at Roman, and the question was on her face before she could shape it into words. And he looked back at her with an expression that was steady and unreadable and told her everything by telling her nothing. She lifted the phone back up. "I'll call you back," she said to Claire Keller. "Lena." She hung up. The silence that followed had a texture to it, dense and close, like the air before a storm when the pressure drops and the birds stop. She looked at Roman. "Nathan Keller," she said. He held her gaze. "The real estate dispute," she said. "Moretti Holdings. That was you." "Yes." One word. Flat. Present. The way he always answered, which she had always taken for honesty and was now recalibrating. "You knew who he was before I told you." She said it slowly, testing each word like footing on ice. "You already knew." Roman didn't answer immediately. That half second, the pause she'd learned to read as him choosing the most accurate version of the truth rather than the most comfortable one, landed in her chest like a coal. "I knew his name," he said, "from the dispute. I didn't connect it to you until the warehouse, the third dinner, when I told you about him." "Yes." She stood up. Not dramatically. She just needed to not be sitting down for this. She moved to the center of the room and turned around and looked at him still on the bench, this man who cooked pasta and sent soup and listened to everything. "So when I told you his name," she said, you already knew enough about him to—" She pressed her hand against her mouth briefly, lowered it. "What have you done, Roman?" "Nothing that wasn't deserved." "That is not an answer." "His law license is under investigation." His voice hadn't changed pitch. "The investigation is based on real documentation. I didn't fabricate anything. He committed billing fraud against 3 separate clients. That documentation exists. I found it and I submitted it through the right channels." "And the rest of it? His client, his apartment, his—" "Pressure," he said. "Legal pressure. Nothing that leaves a mark." She looked at him. Her chest was doing something that she couldn't clearly identify as any one emotion. It was too many things at once, layered and combusting in a way that felt physical. "His wife called me," she said. "His wife, who I have never met, who got my number somehow, your number, because this is your phone, called me to tell me her husband's life is falling apart, and she thinks it's because of me." Roman was quiet. "Is she wrong?" Lena asked. "Technically, is she wrong?" "No," said with the same flatness. "She's not wrong about the sequence." Lena turned away, walked to the far wall, stood there with her back to him and her hand pressed flat against the cold brick, and breathed through the constriction in her ribs that was getting worse. She had told him she had sat at this table, this exact table in this exact room, and she had told him about Nathan, about the years, about the money, about Aligned, and she had done it because he had made her feel safe enough to tell it. Because he had asked with the specific, patient attention of someone who wanted to know. And he had listened, and then he had acted, and he had not told her. She turned back around. "You promised me," she said. Her voice was quiet, and it was worse for being quiet. "You sat right there and you said, if anything changed, if there was any danger, I would know immediately. That was a promise. You weren't in danger. That is not what the promise was about." She pressed her fingers against her temple. "You let me walk around for how long? How long has this been going on?" 3 weeks. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of soup and the farmer's market and the doctor for her wrist and his hand steady at the small of her back when they walked into a room, and him saying, "I don't want to be the reason you stop asking real questions." 3 weeks of all of that while he was quietly, methodically taking Nathan Keller apart and not saying a single word. "You used what I told you," she said. "I acted on it." "Those are the same thing." "They're not." For the first time, something in his voice had an edge. "What you told me was given freely. I didn't ask for his name. You told me. What I did with it had nothing to do with using you." "Then what did it have to do with?" "With the fact that he took $12,000 from a 23-year-old nursing student who worked double shifts to cover his rent," Roman said, and then called it misalignment and walked away, and faced no consequence. For years. The room went quiet again. Lena looked at him. "That wasn't your call to make," she said. "Maybe not. Definitely not." Her voice cracked slightly, and she hated it. "I did not ask you to do that. I did not want you to do that. I spent 3 years putting that behind me and making something out of what was left, and I did not need you to ride in, and—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I'm not a victim who needs avenging. I'm a person who survived something. There's a difference." Roman stood up. He moved with the controlled deliberateness she'd learned to read, crossed to the kitchen counter, stood there with his back half to her. She could see his jaw from this angle, the set of it. "You're right," he said. She blinked. "What?" "You're right." He turned to face her. "I made a decision that wasn't mine to make, and I didn't tell you. Both of those things are true, and I'm not going to argue with either of them." She stared at him. "Don't do that," she said. "Do what?" "Agree with me. It's harder to be angry at you when you agree with me." "I know." Something moved behind his eyes. "I'm still not going to lie to you to make it easier." She put both hands over her face and stood there for a moment in the dark behind her palms. Breathed. Took stock of what was in her chest. The anger, which was real and legitimate and not going anywhere. The hurt underneath it, which was worse. And underneath that, something she was furious at herself for feeling, which was the complicated, unwanted knowledge that Nathan Keller had in fact taken $12,000 from her and faced no consequence for years, and that Roman had done what he'd done out of a furious, proprietary, deeply problematic devotion that she hadn't asked for and couldn't cleanly reject. She lowered her hands. "His wife is terrified," she said. Roman said nothing. "She called me because she has nowhere else to turn, because she's watching her life come apart, and she doesn't know why, and she reached out to a stranger because she was desperate." Lena looked at him steadily. "Did you think about her when you were doing this?" A pause. "No," he said. "That's honest, at least. She chose to marry him. She built a life with him. I don't have information that suggests she's innocent." "She's innocent of whatever he did to me," Lena said sharply. "She didn't take my money. She's just a woman who picked the wrong person to love. I know what that looks like from the inside, Roman. I know exactly what it looks like." He held her gaze, and something in his expression shifted, not much, but enough. The recognition of a thing he hadn't fully considered. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "I want you to stop." She held his gaze. "Whatever's still in motion, I want you to stop it." The silence stretched. "I can stop the pressure on the apartment," he said. "The bar investigation, that's already with the state board, that I can't take back." "Can't or won't?" "The documentation is real, Lena. He committed fraud against real clients. That investigation goes forward with or without me at this point." She looked at the floor. absorbed that. Then stop the rest, she said. Whatever else you have in motion. Okay? She looked up. Just like that? You asked me. I said okay. He held her gaze. That's what it looks like when I mean something. She stood in the middle of the warehouse and felt the anger and the hurt and the other things all moving around each other, none of them settling, and she thought about Claire Keller's voice on the phone. That particular careful composure of a woman holding herself together through force of will. And she thought about herself 3 years ago, doing the same thing. And she thought about the green and white quilt at the farmer's market, and Roman saying, "Come back next Sunday," like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I need to go home," she said. He nodded. "I'll have Gio. I'll take a cab." She picked up her coat from the bench. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. "I need to think without you in the car." He didn't argue. She'd half expected him to argue. "Lena." She was at the door when he said it. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the warehouse, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man who had made a calculation and was not entirely certain it had been right. "I don't regret what he lost. I regret that I didn't tell you." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know the difference," she said. She walked out. Down. The cab ride home took 25 minutes, and she spent most of it with her head against the cold window, watching the city go past and trying to organize what she felt into something manageable. She couldn't. She was in her apartment, coat still on, sitting at her kitchen table with her phone face up in front of her when she called Claire Keller back. Claire answered on the first ring. "Tell me what you need," Lena said. A long pause. I need to understand what's happening, whether it's going to stop." "The apartment situation will stop." She said it carefully. "The bar investigation. He didn't fabricate anything. Nathan did those things." A silence that told her Claire already knew. "He's not a good person," Claire said quietly. "Not defensively, just fact. The way you say facts that have cost you something." "I know that. I've known it for a while." A pause. "But he's the father of my daughter. She's 4. Lena closed her eyes. There it was, the thing that complicated every clean line. A 4-year-old girl who had not chosen any of this. "I'm sorry," Lena said, and meant it. "I'm genuinely sorry." "Did you know? What he was doing to Nathan, did you know before tonight?" "No?" Claire exhaled. It was a long, unsteady sound. "What is Roman Moretti to you?" she asked. Lena looked at her kitchen ceiling, at the water stain that was still there, that had always been there. "I don't have a clean answer to that," she said. "Are you going to stay with him?" "I don't know." Another silence. "Be careful," Claire said finally. Not as a threat, not as a warning between enemies. As one woman to another, both of them standing in the landscape of the same man's decisions. "I know," Lena said. She hung up and sat there in her coat in the quiet of her apartment, and she was still sitting there 40 minutes later when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. Not Roman's, not Gio's, not any number she had in her contacts. A photo. No text. She opened it, her own front door. Taken from across the street, street level, from a car or a low position. She could tell from the angle. Taken tonight. She could see the light in her 4th-floor window, the one she'd turned on when she came in. And then the second message, from the same number, that arrived 10 seconds later. "Tell Mr. Moretti that stopping the pressure was a mistake, and that next time we reach out to the people around him, we won't be as polite." Lena sat absolutely still with her phone in her hands and looked at the photograph of her own door and understood with a cold, full-body clarity that she had crossed a threshold she hadn't seen until she was already on the other side of it. She was not collateral. She was not a bystander who'd wandered into the wrong story. She was a piece on a board, and someone other than Roman had decided to move her. Her phone buzzed again. Roman this time. "My people flagged a vehicle outside your building. Are you okay?" She looked at the photograph one more time, at the light in her window, at the ordinary front door of the building she'd lived in for 2 years, which had just become something else. Evidence, leverage, a message delivered in the language of men who didn't need to break laws to make threats. She thought about what she'd said to Roman, 3 weeks in, sitting in the warehouse for the first time. "I'm not equipped for this." She hadn't been. That had been true. The question now was whether she could afford to remain unequipped, or whether the situation was going to make that choice for her. She looked at her hands. Steady. Steadier than they had any right to be. She typed back, "I'm fine. Come over." And then she stood up, took off her coat, and went to the window and looked down at the street below. The parked cars, the pools of streetlight, the ordinary nighttime geometry of a block that now contained at least one person who wanted her to be afraid. And she made a decision, not about Roman, not about Nathan or Claire or any of the specific wreckage of the last 2 hours. A deeper decision, the kind that didn't have words yet, only direction. She was done being a person things happened to. Whatever came next, she was going to meet it facing forward. She just didn't know yet what it was going to cost her. Roman arrived in 11 minutes. Not Gio. Roman himself, which told her something about the photograph. About what his people had seen in that vehicle outside and what it meant to him that she was the one who'd received the message instead of him. She buzzed him up without speaking through the intercom and left the apartment door unlocked and was standing at the kitchen counter with 2 cups of coffee she'd made, mostly to have something to do with her hands when he came in. He scanned the room first, the automatic, systematic scan of a man who walked into spaces expecting variables. Then he looked at her. "Show me the messages," he said. She handed him her phone. He looked at the photograph for a long time. His face was doing the controlled thing, the thing she'd learned to read past by now. And underneath the control there was something that wasn't anger exactly. It was colder than anger, more structural, the specific quality of a man recalculating a situation and not liking what the numbers produced. He handed the phone back. "Pack a bag," he said. "I'm not leaving my apartment." "Lena, I said I'm not leaving." She set her phone face down on the counter. "This is my home. It's a bad apartment and the elevator doesn't work and I've been here 2 years and it's mine. I'm not letting someone with a camera run me out of it." He looked at her. The jaw was tight. She held his gaze. "One night," he said, "my place, while I deal with this." "And when does it stop? You deal with this, then they escalate, then you deal with that. When does it stop being my life and start being yours?" "It stopped being only your life the night you spilled water on my tablecloth." He said it without apology. "That's the reality of where we are." She opened her mouth, closed it. He was right. She hated that he was right. She packed a bag. His apartment was on the 14th floor and the city was visible from every window, spread out below in the particular nighttime beauty of a place that looked better from a distance. She stood at the window while he made calls in the other room. She could hear the low register of his voice, not the words, just the cadence, the controlled, clipped rhythm of a man giving instructions. She'd been here twice before. Both times it had felt provisional, like a place she was visiting. Standing at the window now with her overnight bag by the door, it felt different, more permanent. The kind of permanent that arrives quietly and announces itself only after it's already happened. He came back into the room, put his phone in his pocket. "The men in the vehicle are contracted," he said, "not from one of the established families, hired." "By who?" "Someone who wants to apply pressure without direct accountability." He crossed the room, stood beside her at the window. "Which narrows it. How many people want to apply pressure to you?" "Fewer than there used to be," said without pride. Just fact. She looked at the city. "What happens now?" "I find who hired them. I make it clear that going through you is a line that doesn't get crossed." "How do you make it clear?" He was quiet for a moment. "The way I make most things clear," he said. She understood what that meant. She'd made her peace, or something that functioned as peace, with not knowing the specifics. But standing at his window at midnight with her overnight bag by his door, the abstraction of it felt harder to maintain. "If something happens to you," she said. Not a question. Not exactly. "Nothing's going to happen to me. That's not—" She turned to look at him. "I'm serious. If something happens to you, I have no footing. I have no standing. I'm just the waitress who is seeing you. I disappear back into nothing, and whatever these people decide to do about that, that's not going to be the situation. Roman." She held his gaze. "I need you to hear what I'm actually saying." He looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed to the desk in the corner, some glass and dark wood, neat in a way that told her he used it regularly, and opened the bottom drawer. Came back with a card. Handed it to her. A name and a number. A lawyer from the firm's address. His name is Sal. He handles everything personal. Roman held her gaze. You call him, you tell him your name, he'll know who you are. He can do things about your nursing program, the debt, anything that needs. I don't want your lawyer. Keep the card anyway. She looked at the card, looked at him. You've thought about this, she said. Me being in a bad position if something happened to you. I think about most things. When did you The night Gio drove you home in the rain. He said it simply. I thought about it then. She stood with the lawyer's card in her hand and thought about a man sitting in the back of a car, calculating her vulnerability as a function of his own, and she felt the complicated, layered thing in her chest that was by now impossible to reduce to any single word. She put the card in her pocket. I'm going to sleep, she said. In the morning, I want to know what you're planning, not the details, the shape of it. And I want a real answer. Okay. And Roman. She picked up her bag. The next time you make a decision that involves my life, Nathan, or anything like Nathan, you tell me first. Before, not after. He held her gaze. Yes. She went to bed in his guest room. She was not yet ready for anything else, and he didn't push, which was one of the things about him she'd filed under evidence. And she lay in the dark and listened to the city below and thought about a 4-year-old girl who hadn't chosen any of this, and about nursing rotations, and about green and white quilts, and eventually she slept. 3 days passed. Roman did not tell her what he was doing, and she did not ask, because she'd drawn the line, and he was observing it, and she was observing the space it created, which was uncomfortable but functional. She went to her shifts. Gio drove her. She didn't argue about Gio anymore. On the 4th day, a Thursday, she was on the floor at Saloni working a regular dinner service when Dale appeared at her elbow with an expression she recognized as the precursor to bad news. There's someone in the bar, he said quietly. Asking for you. Not a customer. She felt the back of her neck tighten. What does he look like? Expensive suit, older. He's been there 20 minutes and he's barely touched his drink. She thought about the man who'd come in before. The one with the pleasantly arranged face and the whiskey and Ms. Hartwell. We work for some people. A different register this time, she thought. Expensive suit, older. Someone higher up the chain. Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes, she said. She finished the table she was on, told herself her hands were steady because they were steady, not because she was forcing them. Went to the bar. The man was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, with the polished, self-contained look of someone who had spent decades in rooms where decisions were made. He was drinking scotch, barely touched, and he looked at her when she approached without surprise, without performance. Ms. Hartwell. He indicated the stool beside him. Please. I'll stand. He accepted this without reaction. My name is Arthur Crane. I represent certain business interests that have been in conflict with Mr. Moretti's operations. I know what you are, she said, or close enough. Something in his expression registered this with what might have been approval. Then I'll be direct. The photograph we sent to your phone, that was a miscalculation on the part of people acting without my full authorization. I want you to know that. You're apologizing. I'm clarifying. He lifted his scotch, set it down without drinking. My conflict with Roman Moretti is professional. It's about territory, about agreements that weren't honored, about money. It has nothing to do with you personally. He paused. I'd like to keep it that way. Then why are you here? Because I need a message delivered, and I believe you're the one person in Moretti's circle who he'll actually listen to. She looked at him. You want me to deliver a message to Roman? I want you to tell him that I'm prepared to resolve this, formally. That there's a meeting being proposed, neutral ground, both sides represented, real negotiation. Crane held her gaze. I'm tired of escalation. It's expensive and it's messy and it's bad for everyone. Tell him Arthur Crane wants to sit down. She stood at the bar and looked at this man and thought about the photograph of her front door and the vehicle outside her building, and Claire Keller's voice saying, "Be careful," and the card from Roman's lawyer in her apartment drawer. Why not reach out to him directly? She asked. Because he won't take my call, and he won't take a meeting through standard channels. He thinks I'm the one who authorized the photograph. A pause. I need someone he trusts to tell him otherwise. And you think that's me? I know it's you. He said it plainly. I know what you are to him, which is information I'm not using as leverage. I want to be clear about that. I'm using it as a communication strategy. She looked at him for a long moment. I'll tell him, she said. I'm not promising anything beyond that. That's all I'm asking. She started to turn away. Ms. Hartwell. She stopped. Crane turned the scotch glass slowly on the bar. What you are to him, you should know it's not nothing. In 30 years of this work, I've seen Roman Moretti make room for approximately no one. What he's done, he paused, choosing words. The changes he's made to his operations in the last 2 months. The lines he's drawn, that's not standard behavior. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you this because it's relevant to any decision you make about your own future. She stood there a moment, then she walked back to the floor without responding, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't cost her something. She told Roman that night. He was quiet for a longer time than usual after she finished. Crane is telling the truth, he said finally. The photograph wasn't him. I've already confirmed that. Then who? Someone who works for him and took initiative. His voice had a flatness to it that she now recognized as the particular register of a man who had already decided what happened to that person. It's been handled. She didn't ask what handled meant. Will you take the meeting? She asked. If Crane comes to the table with real terms, yes. He looked at her. You did well. I delivered a message. Don't make it more than it is. It took nerve. Everything in the last 2 months has taken nerve, she said. I'm running low. He looked at her, and then Roman Moretti, who she had watched be still and controlled in every situation, who she had never seen reach without it meaning something, crossed the space between them and put his hand against the side of her face, thumb at her jaw, and she felt the warmth of it go straight through the exhaustion. I know, he said quietly. She didn't pull back. She also didn't close the distance. They stood there in the kitchen of the warehouse, suspended between one thing and the next, and she felt the full weight of everything that had accumulated over 2 months. The soup and the driver and the lawyer's card and the photograph and the 4-year-old girl and Nathan's name and Arthur Crane's scotch glass turning on the bar, all of it pressing against the inside of her chest like something that needed resolution. I'm not ready, she said. Not an apology, just a fact. I know. He didn't move his hand. I'm not going anywhere. She believed him. That was the part she couldn't argue with. She also understood, in a way she hadn't fully let herself understand until this moment, that not going anywhere was not the same as things being safe. The meeting happened 4 days later. She wasn't invited. Roman told her the location, a private room at a hotel on the north side, neutral ground as promised. And she spent the 3 hours it ran doing a shift at Salone on autopilot, refilling glasses and reciting specials, and tracking the clock on the service station display with the careful, controlled patience of a woman who had run out of alternatives to waiting. Gio texted her at 9:47. Done. Clean. She exhaled, sent back a thumbs up, served the 9 o'clock dessert course. Roman called at 10:30 after her shift. It's resolved, he said. Terms? Crane gets the Southside contract. We keep the port operation. There's a non-interference agreement going forward with real consequences attached. A pause. It's done. She stood outside the back door of Salone in the cold night air with her phone and felt the thing in her chest that had been wound tight for 2 weeks' release, slightly, like a knot eased but not untied. And the people who sent the photograph? She asked. A pause. They won't be in a position to do it again. She decided to leave it there. I want to talk to you, she said. Tonight. Not about any of this. About the other thing. He was quiet for a moment. I'll come to you. No. The warehouse. She looked up at the sky, clouded over, no stars. I need it to be somewhere that's ours. Not mine, not yours. She could hear, in the brief silence that followed, something that she would have called relief in anyone else. I'll be there in an hour, he said. She was there in 40 minutes. Sat at the table alone in the amber light of the warehouse and thought about everything she was going to say, and none of it felt adequate because some things didn't have adequate language. They just had the weight of a decision and the understanding that making it changed the shape of everything after. She heard the door, heard his footsteps on the wood floor. She turned around, and then her phone rang. She almost didn't answer it. She was a half second from sending it to voicemail. Roman was 10 feet away, and her expression must have said as much because he stopped walking. When she saw the number, Dayton area code, her mother. Her mother never called this late. She answered, "Mom, Lena." Her mother's voice had a quality she'd only heard twice before in her life. The quality of a person trying to be calm for the benefit of the person they're calling. "Something's happened. I need you to listen to me." Roman watched her face. She watched the floor. "Okay," she said. "I'm listening." "Nathan Keller was found this evening," her mother said. "In his car, in the garage of his house." A pause that had years in it. "Honey, he's gone." The warehouse went completely silent around her. She looked up at Roman. He was already watching her with the still, careful expression of a man who was very good at knowing when something had arrived that was going to change everything, and who understood, before she'd said a single word, that whatever had just come through the phone was the thing they'd been moving toward all along. She lowered the phone. "Nathan Keller is dead," she said. Roman held her gaze and said nothing. And in the silence between them, in the warehouse on Brennan Street, with the city running its indifferent machinery outside and the amber light holding them both in its small, warm radius, she saw in his face, for just a fraction of a second, the thing he wasn't going to say. He already knew. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't do any of the things that people did in movies when they received news like this, because the news hadn't fully landed yet. It was still suspended somewhere above her, waiting for a surface to hit, and the surface wasn't ready. What she did was set the phone down on the table with a care that was almost absurd given the circumstances, and then she pulled out the chair nearest her and sat down in it with the deliberate, measured movement of someone who understood that their legs were about to stop working. Roman hadn't moved from where he'd stopped walking. She looked at him across the warehouse floor, across the amber light, and the wooden table, and the space between them that had always contained multitudes, and she said, "Tell me what you know." He crossed to the table, sat down across from her, not beside her, not behind her, directly across, where she could see his face, where there was nowhere to hide in either direction. "The ruling will be suicide," he said. "Carbon monoxide, his car, his garage, nothing staged, nothing. It wasn't done to him, Lena. He did it himself." She absorbed that. "But you knew," she said, "before I told you. You already knew. I was told 40 minutes ago. I was coming to tell you tonight. That was what tonight was going to be. 40 minutes. She looked at her hands on the table. "You knew for 40 minutes before I walked into this warehouse, and you didn't lead with it. I was going to tell you. After what? After whatever conversation I came here to have, you were going to let me say whatever I came to say, and then I didn't know how to open with it." His voice was flat, but under the flatness was something rougher. "There's no good way to open with it." She looked at him. The anger was there, but it was moving through something larger, and she couldn't isolate it cleanly, couldn't pick it out from the grief. And she recognized with distant surprise that there was grief, which she hadn't expected. Not for Nathan, not the way you grieved someone you'd loved, but for the 23-year-old who had loved him, for the girl who'd worked double shifts and deferred her future and believed that sacrifice meant something. She was grieving for that girl, which was different from grieving for him, and she hadn't known until this moment that she still had that grief in her. "His daughter," she said. "She's 4 years old." Roman said nothing. "Did you know about her?" "Yes." "When you decided to go after him, I knew." The word landed between them like something dropped from a height. She looked at his face. This face she'd been learning for 2 months, the exact geography of it, the controlled jaw, the dark eyes that collected everything, the scar on his left knuckle that caught the light at certain angles. And she thought about what it would mean to love someone whose decisions included this, whose capacity for devotion and whose capacity for destruction were not separate things, but the same thing, operating simultaneously, inseparable. "Did your people push him toward it?" she asked. "The bar investigation, the client, the apartment. Did you know that was the direction it would go?" He held her gaze. "I knew it was a possible direction," he said. "I didn't engineer it. I didn't want it. But you didn't stop it either." "I stopped what you asked me to stop. 3 weeks in." Her voice cracked slightly. "After it was already..." She pressed her fingers against her eyes, after most of it was already done. The silence had weight. A 4-year-old girl, she said again, quieter. She's going to grow up without a father. Claire Keller is going to have to explain this to her eventually. How do you explain this? She lowered her hands. How does she explain to her daughter that her father fell apart? That the world just dismantled him? The world didn't dismantle him. Roman's voice was level, but something in it was raw, a quality she hadn't heard before. He dismantled himself. He defrauded clients. He used people and left them with nothing. The bar investigation was real, Lena. I didn't manufacture. I know. She cut him off. Not harshly, just firmly. I know that. I'm not saying he was innocent. I'm saying... She stopped. Reorganized. I'm saying that he was a person. A terrible one in some important ways, but a person. And you and I sat in this room and I told you what he did to me. And something in you decided that wasn't going to stand, and now he's dead in his garage and his daughter doesn't have a father. She looked at him directly. And I need you to understand that I cannot pretend that's nothing. Even if he was awful, even if he deserved consequences, I cannot pretend that's nothing. Roman held her gaze. I don't expect you to, he said. Then what do you expect? He was quiet for a long moment, longer than usual. She watched him working through something. Not the diplomatic calculation of a man managing a situation, but the genuine, undefended struggle of someone who had arrived somewhere they hadn't anticipated. I expect you to be angry, he said finally. I expect you to need time. And I'm telling you that I will be here when that time is up, however long it takes, because what I feel about you is not conditional on whether you're comfortable with what I am. He paused. But I need you to understand something in return. She waited. What I did, going after him. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't about the South Side dispute or Crane or territory or any piece of the business. It was about you. He held her gaze with an intensity that was almost physical in its pressure. I watched you sit in this room and describe 3 years of survival as if they were normal, as if being taken from and left with nothing and just keeping going, as if that was just the weather, as if it didn't cost you anything. His jaw tightened. It cost you everything, and he walked away. And I am not built to let that stand. I know that's not what you needed. I know it caused harm. I am telling you anyway because you asked me to be honest, and this is what honest looks like. The warehouse was very quiet. Lena sat with it, all of it. The whole accumulated weight of 2 months and 1 phone call from Dayton and a man across a table who was exactly what he'd told her he was from the beginning. She'd simply been learning how much that meant. I need to call my mother back, she said. Okay, and then I need to not be here for a while. She looked at him. I'm not leaving. I'm not making that decision tonight. But I need to be somewhere that isn't this and isn't your apartment and isn't anywhere that's about this, for a few days. He nodded. Where? My mother's, Dayton. She hadn't known that was what she was going to say until she said it. She doesn't know anything about you. I'm not going to tell her. I just need to be in a place where I was a person before all of this started. I'll have Gio. I'll take the train. She held his gaze. I need to do that part myself. He looked at her for a moment. Then, okay. She stood up, picked up her phone. At the door, she stopped and turned back. He was still at the table watching her, and in the amber light of the warehouse, he looked, not diminished, that wasn't the word. Roman Moretti was not a man who could be reduced, but human, in a way that was more visible than usual. The specific humanness of someone who had done something that couldn't be undone and was sitting with the full weight of that. I don't regret knowing you, she said. I want you to know that. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a name for. Go call your mother, he said quietly. She went. Dayton in November was gray and familiar and smelled like her childhood, which was a complicated smell. Good things and hard things layered together over decades into something that was simply home. Her mother, Barbara, was 61 and practical and perceptive in the way of women who had raised children alone and learned to read situations quickly because there was no one else to read them. She didn't ask questions Lena wasn't ready to answer. She made soup, real soup, the slow kind, the kind that had been on the stove for hours, and she let Lena sleep until 10 in the morning and didn't knock on the door until noon. On the second day, Lena told her about the nursing program, not the whole history. Barbara knew the broad strokes, knew about Nathan, knew about the dropout, knew about the waitressing, but Lena told her about the farmer's market and the green and white quilt, and the way it had felt to look at something made with 3 months of deliberate choices and understand in her body that she had stopped making deliberate choices. Barbara listened the way Barbara always listened, with both hands around her coffee cup and her eyes steady and her mouth shut. When Lena finished, Barbara said, "So, go back." "It's not that simple, Mom." "When has simple ever been what we work with?" Lena looked at the kitchen table, the same table she'd sat at for 18 years, scratched in the corner where she'd dragged a textbook across it in 9th grade, worn smooth at the edges from decades of elbows and coffee cups and lives being lived. "There's someone," she said. Barbara looked at her. "Complicated," Lena added. "They always are. More complicated than usual." "How much more?" Lena looked at her coffee. "He's powerful. In ways that aren't all legitimate." She paused. "He did something I didn't ask him to do. Something that hurt someone. Because of me." Another pause. "The person it hurt is dead now. Not because of what Roman did, not directly, but not entirely unconnected either." Barbara was quiet for a long moment. "Do you love him?" she asked. Lena opened her mouth, closed it. "I don't know how to answer that without it sounding like a justification," she said. "I didn't ask you to justify it. I asked if you loved him." She looked at the scratched corner of the table, thought about soup on a Tuesday and a doctor for her wrist and a lawyer's card in a drawer and a man who had called a calling. A calling like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Thought about him sitting at the warehouse table after she'd told him she needed to leave, not arguing, not following, just, "Okay." "Yes," she said. "I think I have been for a while." Barbara nodded slowly, the nod of a woman processing something and not revealing the result. "People are complicated," she said finally. "Love is complicated. The question is never whether someone is perfect." She lifted her coffee. "The question is whether they see you, really see you, and whether that seeing makes you more or less yourself." Lena thought about a calling, and you're not just anything, and I know you mean it. That's one of the things that matters. "More," she said quietly. "It makes me more." "Then that's what you work with." Chan. She was in Dayton for 4 days. On the 3rd day, she called the nursing school's re-enrollment office and listened to a recorded message about the re-entry process and wrote down a phone number and didn't call it yet, but wrote it down. On the 4th day, she called Roman. He answered on the 2nd ring, same as always. "Hi," she said. A beat. "Hi. I'm coming back tomorrow." "Okay." She was quiet for a moment. Outside her mother's kitchen window, a bare-limbed maple stood in the November gray, and she looked at it and thought about how trees looked dead in winter but weren't. "I need to say something, and I need you to just let me say it," she said. "Okay. What happened with Nathan? I can't retroactively make that something I'm fine with. It crossed a line that I'd drawn, and you knew it, and you did it anyway, and a person is dead, and a child doesn't have a father. Those are facts that don't go away." She paused, breathed. "And I'm also aware that the investigation was real, that he committed actual fraud against actual people, that his choices made him fragile before you ever knew his name." Another pause. "I'm holding both of those things, and I don't think one cancels the other out, and I'm not asking you to tell me it does." "I'm not going to tell you that," Roman said. "Good." She pressed her hand against the cold window pane. "I'm asking you to promise me something." "What?" "Anything that touches my life, any decision you make where I'm any part of the reason, you come to me first, before. Not with the details, I don't need the details, but I get a voice. I get to say yes or no. Because I'm not cargo, Roman. I'm not something you carry and protect. I'm a person who gets to choose what my life looks like." The silence on his end was thoughtful, not defensive. "Yes," he said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it." A pause. "Come home." The word landed, home, and she stood at her mother's window and felt it settle somewhere in her chest that it hadn't lived before. Tomorrow, she said. Train gets in at 4. I'll have... I know, she said. Gio will be there. She could hear, in the breath that followed, the thing that functioned in Roman Moretti as a smile. Tag. She re-enrolled in January. The nursing school's re-entry process took 6 weeks of paperwork and a meeting with the academic dean, who was brisk and professional, and told her she'd need to complete a skills refresher and 1 additional clinical placement before she could sit for her boards. She said yes to all of it without negotiating. Roman paid off her debt. She found out when she checked her student loan balance in February and found a 0 where 5 digits used to be. And she called him and said she needed to pay him back, and he said the money was not a loan, and she said she was paying him back anyway, and he said fine, and she paid him back over 11 months an amount she could manage from her shifts, which she was still working because she decided she needed to finish her degree before she let herself be carried by anyone. He understood that. He made no argument. The large things she'd feared, the danger, the exposure, the sense of being a target, resolved in the way that large things sometimes did when the immediate crisis passed. Slowly, then completely. Crane's agreement held. The men who'd sent the photograph to her phone did not resurface. The city went on being the city, vast and indifferent, and Roman went on running his empire from its shadows, and Lena went on being a person in the world. Not invisible, not cargo, not the waitress who needed protecting. She was also, by March, 3 weeks into her skills refresher and getting her footing back. And the thing that happened when she walked into a clinical setting, the specific quiet alignment of herself with the work, the sense of being in the right place doing the right thing, was still there. 3 years of double shifts hadn't taken it. She thought about the kid with the broken arm sometimes, hoped he'd grown up fine. Claire Keller called her once more, in February. She was leaving the city, she said, moving back to her parents to give her daughter stability. She was okay. She wanted Lena to know that. She also wanted Lena to know she didn't blame her, had never blamed her. The bar investigation had been real. She'd understood that eventually. And Nathan had been... She used the word struggling, and Lena understood it was the word she'd chosen to use with her daughter someday, the word that left the door open for a child to build something out of. He had been struggling for a long time. Lena said she was sorry for what had happened to their family. Claire said, "Take care of yourself." Lena said, "You too." They didn't speak again. It was Roman who told her the following November, exactly 1 year after a water pitcher tipped on a white tablecloth, that he had been thinking about the future. They were in the warehouse. They were almost always in the warehouse for the things that mattered, as if they'd agreed without discussing it that this was where the real conversations happened. This converted space with its amber light and its wooden table and its smell of good food and the city at its back. He'd cooked. He almost always cooked. She'd stopped marveling at it and started expecting it, which was its own kind of intimacy. She was sitting at the table with a glass of red wine she hadn't touched yet when he came over from the counter and stood at the end of the table and didn't sit down, which told her something was coming before he said a word. She looked up at him. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. "I know. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to take as long as you need to answer it." She set down her wine glass. He reached into the pocket of his jacket. The charcoal suit, no tie, collar open, the same configuration she'd cataloged in the back of her mind that first night, and set something on the table between them. A ring, simple. White gold band, 1 stone, nothing theatrical. She looked at it, looked at him. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not as a temporary arrangement, not as something we negotiate month to month, permanently." His voice was the same as always. Level, direct, neither demanding nor performing. And she understood this was exactly what he looked like when he was more serious than he had ever been about anything. "I know what I am. I know it's not simple. I know you're going to finish your degree and become a nurse and walk into hospitals and save people, and I'm going to be..." He paused. "What I am. And I know that's an unusual combination." "That's one word for it," she said. "I'm asking anyway." She looked at the ring on the table, thought about everything it represented. Not just him, not just the warehouse and the soup and the lawyer's card and the green and white quilt, but all of it together. The whole accumulated structure of a life she hadn't planned, but had somehow built. One difficult choice at a time, out of the wreckage of a previous one. She thought about being 23 and working double shifts and believing that sacrifice meant something. She thought about being 26 and invisible and carrying a water pitcher that was too heavy on a Tuesday night when she was already running on empty. She thought about his face when she'd told him the nursing program was a calling, the way he'd said it back to her like a fact, like it was already true and always had been and she'd just forgotten. She reached out and picked up the ring, turned it once between her fingers. The stone caught the amber light. "I'm going to finish my degree," she said. "I know. And I'm going to work in a hospital, regular shifts, sometimes nights. Sometimes I'll come home tired and I won't want to be managed. I know. And if you ever, anything, Roman, anything that touches my life without asking, I walk. No second conversation. I walk. I know." His voice was quiet. "I've always known that about you." She looked up at him. This impossible, dangerous, very real man who had seen her nearly drop a water pitcher and decided that was the thing worth paying attention to. Who cooked dinner and listened completely and called things what they were. Who had also done the thing with Nathan, which she had not forgiven cleanly and probably never would entirely, but had found a way to carry alongside the rest of it. The way you carried the complicated things, not by making them simple, but by deciding they were yours to hold. She put the ring on. It fit. She was not surprised that it fit. He looked at her hand, then at her face, and she saw in his expression, in the precise, controlled face of a man who had spent 20 years revealing nothing, something open. Something that had no other word but relief, the deep structural kind, the kind that came from a person who had not known, until this moment, how much they had been hoping. "Don't make me cry in this warehouse," she said. Something happened to his mouth. "I wouldn't dare." She stood up. He didn't move. Let her come to him, which was exactly right, which was one of the 1,000 things that were exactly right about him underneath all the things that were not. She crossed the distance and put her hand against his chest and felt the beat of his heart under her palm, steady and real. And he put his arms around her and she let herself be held without calling it anything other than what it was. Outside, the city ran its indifferent machinery, traffic and rain and the low, persistent hum of a place that didn't stop for individual lives. Inside the warehouse, in the amber light, two people who had arrived here from opposite directions stood still for a moment together. She thought about the green and white quilt, the woman who had made it over 3 months, choosing each square deliberately. She understood it now in a way she hadn't at the market. Not just the patience of it, but the faith of it. The commitment to a pattern before you could see how it would turn out. The willingness to keep choosing, square by square, even when the finished thing was still far away and unimaginable. She had been choosing for a year. This was what it looked like when you finally saw the shape. 6 months later, she stood in a hospital hallway in blue scrubs with a badge that said Lena Hartwell, RN, Pediatric Unit, and she had just talked a 9-year-old boy named Marcus through a blood draw by finding out he was obsessed with dinosaurs and spending 10 minutes explaining which ones were apex predators. And by the time the needle went in, he was mid-sentence about velociraptors and he didn't even flinch. She threw away the latex gloves, washed her hands at the sink, looked at herself in the small mirror above the basin. The woman looking back at her was tired in the specific good way, the way of someone who had worked hard at something that mattered. Her hair was pulled back. There was a coffee stain on her left sleeve from 7 o'clock that she hadn't had time to deal with. The ring on her left hand caught the fluorescent light. The stone turned white instead of amber. She was 27 years old. She had been invisible once, and then she had been a target, and then she had been someone's reason, and she had spent a long time figuring out which of those things she was willing to be and which ones she was not. She was a nurse. She was a woman who had made her choices with her eyes open, including the complicated ones, especially the complicated ones. She was most importantly the version of herself she had been trying to get back to for 3 years, the one who walked into a room and knew what she was there for and got it done. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Roman. A single line. "How's the shift?" She dried her hands on a paper towel. Typed back. "Velociraptors. Long story. Home by 8. His response came in under a minute. "I'll cook." She pocketed the phone, pulled her badge straight, walked back out into the hall where Marcus was being wheeled back to his room and his mother was saying something to him in a low voice, And he was still talking about dinosaurs to anyone who would listen. She smiled at him as she passed. He waved at her with the arm that didn't have the bandage. She kept walking. Down the corridor, past the nurse's station, into the next room, into the next moment of a life that had not turned out anything like she'd planned and had turned out, against all reasonable probability, like exactly what she needed. The city was out there somewhere, running its machinery. She was in here, doing her work. A dangerous beginning, an impossible love. A future neither of them had expected, but both of them, day by day, choice by choice, were willing to fight for. That was enough. That was everything.